Hello there, and welcome to our Made in London talk. We're talking about things that have been created, invented, pioneered, produced in London, or Londoners that have made things, Londoners that have lived here and made things. You can see I've invented a few little crafts that you can make as well as a little souvenir. They're either on our Facebook page or at virtuallylondon.com on the DIY souvenirs tab. My name's Rebecca. I've been a tour guide, for since 2006, and a virtual tour guide since 2020. Gentleman on my left here is who I learnt a lot of my stuff from.
Oh, thank you. Faint praise and all that. My name is Gordon. I've been a tour guide since probably the beginning of time.
And we're going to talk a little bit about all the things that have been made in London. And we're doing something actually today that we could never do, neither of us would ever be able to do on a real life tour, sort of taking advantage of the virtual nature of this. We're going to go up a tube line and talk about different things at every tube stop. So we've chosen the Victoria line. So we're going from Victoria down at the bottom here up to King's Cross up at the top. So Victoria's King's Cross, and we've got little themes for each tube station that we're going to go along. And we're starting at Victoria, down at the bottom there. There's our Google map of Victoria. If you've watched any of our other videos, by the way, I usually draw little hand-drawn maps, but there's too many maps for every tube station, so I've nicked these from Google. I'm terribly sorry, Google. So we're starting in Victoria. Our theme for Victoria is writers and composers. Because I'm considering that a creation, if you're creating a piece of art or a music rather, or writing. Fortunately, we've got right next to Victoria Station is an area called Belgravia. So this area to the left here on the map is Belgravia. And Belgravia is a really desirable residential area and has been since the early 1800s. So a lot of well-known writers and composers have lived in Belgravia. So we're kind of spoiled for choice, actually, around here. I'm going to start out on Ebury Street, which is circled there. Ebury Street, there it is on Street View. So Ebury Street, we've got a few famous names who've lived on Ebury Street. Noel Coward, his parents had a lodging house on Ebury Street and he had a room there. Lord Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, lived on Ebury Street briefly. Alfred Lord Tennyson was the first person to be awarded a peerage because of his writing, because of his poetry. Lady of Shalott. Was Lady of Shalott Tennyson? Anyway. It's also where Vita Sackville West lived as well with her husband, Vita Sackville West, who had an affair with Virginia Woolf, and she was the inspiration for Orlando, so they say. Round the corner from Ebury Street is Eaton Square, which is really quite lovely buildings. Eaton Square, this is a very expensive area, by the way. One of these parking spaces is going to cost you about £250,000 just for the parking space. Eaton Square is, who have we got here? We've got Raymond Chandler, the author, lived in Eaton Square. He called his place in Eaton Square his pokey little place in London. And Andrew Lloyd Webber lived in Eaton Square as well. Andrew Lloyd Webber, who some credit with inventing the modern stage musical. And while we're on composers, there's a lot of composer stories kind of scattered around Belgravia. So there we've got Eaton Square, which is where Andrew Lloyd Webber lived. Just around the corner, Eaton Place is where Frédéric Chopin gave his first London concert in the 1840s, same year he died, actually. On Hobart Place up there is where Felix Mendelssohn used to live when he was in London. There's Mendelssohn impressing Queen Victoria. He used to go to, when he was in London, he'd go to Buckingham Palace and play for the royals. And here he is impressing, they don't look very impressed in the picture, but she wrote in her diaries that he asked if anyone had a piece of music they would like to play. And Prince Albert shouted out, "Oh, the Austrian national anthem," and Queen Victoria shouted out, "Rule Britannia," thinking he would play them one after the other, but Mendelssohn played them both at the same time, one with each hand. So that's them going, "Oh, isn't he clever?" And elsewhere in Belgravia, down at the bottom there, a little further south than that drawing actually, is where Mozart, young Mozart lived. There's young Mozart at the piano. The house on Ebury Street, where he was living with his father and sister when they were on a European tour, is where he wrote his first symphony on Ebury Street when he was 8 years old. Because who hasn't written a symphony when they're 8? You know what I mean?
Mm.
And Chester Square, there is where we're going next. Well, I say we, and this is one of yours, actually, isn't it?
Is it?
Yeah.
Mary Shelley.
Yeah.
Mary Shelley lived in Chester Square towards the end of her life, and in fact, she passed away in Chester Square in 1851, rather sadly. She wrote the novel Frankenstein, not in Chester Square. She wrote it when she was 19, and at the time on a holiday with her husband Percy Shelley and John Polidori and Lord Byron, and they're all in Lake Geneva in Switzerland, which is all very lovely and wonderful, but the weather was dreadful. And the writers decided rather, because of the weather, they decided to try and scare each other by writing horror stories. Polidori wrote one of the first vampire stories, which I believe was Varney the Vampire, but I could be completely wrong. That's conjecture. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is not the earliest horror story, but it is considered one of the most influential, and some say it should be considered the very first science fiction story. Ian Fleming lived nearby on Ebury Street in the late 1930s, and he had his London home at Victoria Square after he was married. Most of his James Bond novels, and of course Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, were written at his estate in the Caribbean, which we call Golden Eye. But he did hold a party in Victoria Square after the film premiere of From Russia with Love. And finally, this from the Ministry of Random Information, the first British actor to play James Bond was actually Bob Holness in a radio play of Moonraker in 1956, before his Countdown days.
Blockbusters.
Yeah. Sorry, Blockbusters. Oh, see, I'm so out of the
loop. Yes, I'll have a B, please, Bob.
Yes.
Right, so that's Victoria. There are plenty of other writers and authors and artists and composers around Belgravia, but we'll leave it at that. Because we're getting back on the tube and going north to Green Park. Whoops, you're right.
Yeah.
And going north to Green Park. So there's Green Park on the tube and there's Green Park on our Google map. Just along the road. Oh, sorry, this is one of yours.
There are a few steps away from Green Park Station, along Piccadilly, is a department store where the Queen buys her grocery. Well, I say she buys her groceries. She doesn't go there with a carrier bag. She sent her gentleman to Fortnum and Mason. It was founded by two chaps who once worked for Queen Anne, and they used to, let's be diplomatic here, recycle leftover candles from the royal stores, selling them in their own shop. Okay. In 1886, an American entrepreneur came to Fortnum and Mason's with a brand new product. It wasn't terribly popular in the US, but he hoped it would be popular in England. The entrepreneur was named Henry Hines, and as you probably guessed, the product was baked beans, which were first sold at Fortnum and Mason's, strangely enough. The baked beans have continued to be popular in England, with or without Weetabix. They have been so popular that during the Second World War, when food was rationed, they were considered an essential foodstuff. The store has another food-related first. In 1738, Fortnum and Mason's invented a portable snap intended for travellers and picnickers. It's thought it was inspired by a similar dish in Indian cuisine, and it was named the Scotch egg. For those unfamiliar with it, it's a boiled egg wrapped in meat, usually pork, and coated in breadcrumbs. The recipe here is from 1809. As you can see, the meat originally contained anchovies, and it's probably why it was called the Scotch egg, as Scotch was used as a term for anything that had anchovies in it. Although there is also a legend that it got the name Scotch egg because the Scots guards from the nearby Wellington barracks particularly liked it. They were very fond of it. So it's possibly apocryphal, but there we go. In 2019, Scotch eggs were among the least liked foods in the UK, along with bubble and squeak, haggis, jellied eels, and black pudding. With a newfound love of all things healthy, I suppose a high fat diet was looked frowned upon all of a sudden. So yeah, they did enjoy a revival in 2020 after a controversy over whether they were considered a substantial enough meal for pubs to open during one of the phases of COVID lockdown.
Yeah. Good old Fortnum's then. Scotch eggs and baked beans. Yummy. There's a lot of other food-related sort of facts in the area, so I'll try and whiz through a few of them. So just behind Fortnum and Mason, where the red circle there is Jermyn Street. At 113 Jermyn Street, there it is. It's now a little cafe. But in the 1830s, a butcher moved in here called Richard Wall. He'd owned a market stall, but not long before that, in the 1820s, he'd become the provider of sausages to King George IV. His official title was the Royal Purveyor of Pork, which is just marvellous. So he's got the money to buy a shop. He buys this lovely shop on Jermyn Street. And his descendants keep running the shops, known as Walls, eventually Walls Sausages. They continued to sell sausages to the royal family. Queen Victoria had there was a specific recipe for Queen Victoria. She had to have fresh eggs, freshly boiled eggs, and hand chopped mince, free range eggs as well. So they continue to be. In just before the First World War, around the time of the First World War, one of the Walls brothers, I think Thomas Wall II, had the idea that he wanted to make ice cream in the summer. Because what was happening before that was that in the summer months, he had to lay off a lot of his staff because nobody wanted a hot sausage or a hot pie in the summer. So he decided, right, so my employees can keep their jobs year round, I'm going to start making ice cream. And suddenly, all over London, came the ice cream trikes. Leaving from this little shop on Jermyn Street, these little ice cream trikes would pedal around from the early 20th century with Stop Me and Buy One. He didn't play ice cream music, he had a bell, but Wall's ice cream was invented in Jermyn Street. Or ice cream delivery, rather, was invented in Jermyn Street. Just off Jermyn Street, in fact, around the corner from where Walls used to be, is the Prince's Arcade. It's a lovely little covered shopping arcade, very sweet.
Sorry.
Are you stealing my stuff now?
Am I?
The Prince's Arcade is a chocolate shop. Prince's Arcade contains Prestat, rather, which is a very nice chocolate shop. Said to be a favourite of Roald Dahl. There's Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl, who famously loved chocolate and particularly Prestat. He loved chocolates the way Prestat used to do them, I think is one of his quotes. Prestat was directly mentioned in Dahl's book, My Uncle Oswald, which is for mummies and daddies, don't read it, children. And the Prestat shop is thought to be the inspiration for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Up on Clifford Street, here's Bucks Club. Bucks Club is the barman in 1921. Bucks Club is a private members-only club, by the way. It still exists, but you can't go in it unless you're a member. In 1921, the barman there, McGarry, invented the Bucks Fizz down at Bucks Club, which is champagne and orange juice. But it's said, I mean, I'm not a member at Bucks, so I've never been in, but apparently there's a secret ingredient in the Bucks Fizz at Bucks Club that only the barman at Bucks ever know, and they're sworn to secrecy. Apparently, almost every club and hotel bar in the area also claims to be the one that created the martini that inspired James Bond's martini. Ian Fleming used to drink in quite a lot of the clubs around here, so probably never pin it down. And another club nearby, the Reform Club, which is down on Pall Mall, down underneath Roald Dahl, is where Alexi Sawyer worked in the mid-1800s. Alexi Sawyer is basically the first celebrity chef. Alexi Sawyer worked in the Reform Club in the kitchens. He did out the kitchens with some of the earliest gas ovens, some of the earliest ovens with temperature dials, adjustable temperature, some of the earliest refrigerators using cold water and ice. And they used to do tours of the kitchens, and Alexi Sawyer was there being a celebrity chef. And like celebrity chefs, he put out recipe books, but not just recipe books for rich people. You can see here the Shilling Cookery book was for people who couldn't afford expensive ingredients or expensive equipment. And he also invented what he called the magic stove, just essentially a portable tabletop hob, which he had invented to help people in Ireland during the Irish famine. But it was also used for the British Army as well, for soldiers, particularly Crimean War. It was used a lot. And this from the Ministry of Random Information, as you say. Alexi Sawyer's wife, Emma, was an artist. She actually sold a lot of her art to help the abolition cause. When she was younger, she was one of the youngest people to ever exhibit at the Royal Academy when she was only 10 years old. Right, carrying on up to Oxford Circus. Back up the tube now. So we're back on the tube at Green Park up to Oxford Circus. And our theme is entertainment around Oxford Circus. So we've got lots of entertainment. There's Oxford Circus Underground Station. And music and entertainment is definitely your territory. So.
Okay. A few steps away from Oxford Circus is the University of Westminster. This was founded as the Royal Polytechnic Institution in 1837 and has had several famous alumni in the field of entertainment, including the drummer of the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watts, fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, and writer and producer Charlie Brooker. It's where the founding members of Pink Floyd studied, Nick Mason, Roger Waters, and Rick Wright. Nick Mason dropped out in the 1960s, but returned 50 years later to finally finish his architecture degree. So there we go. Most importantly, perhaps, is the University of Westminster is where John Ryan studied, the creator of Captain Pugwash. Well, there you go, it's no telling. There we go. The university is also where Jimi Hendrix played publicly for the first time in the UK. Hendrix and his manager, Chas Chandler, who was the bass player for the Animals, they bumped into each other and they bumped into members of Cream in a pub where they were having a strengthening drink before they gig. Chas Chandler suggested that Hendrix played with them, and the band agreed. Legend has it that after Hendrix had performed, Clapton complained to Chandler that I didn't think you meant he was that flipping good, except he didn't say flipping, of course, rather more earthy. But yeah. They were rather gobsmacked, to say the least.
Yes, you've got a few more music things, but I just want to do a non-music thing before you get the rest of the interesting music stuff. Get rid of that lot. Sorry, those rock legends. Just next to University of Westminster is Regent Street Cinema. Just on the left there is Regent Street Cinema. Regent Street Cinema was originally a theatre, but actually some people say it's the first purpose-built cinema in the UK because it was built with magic lantern projection in mind. So not movies, it was pre-movies being invented, films being invented, but it was magic lanterns it was designed for. It was where the very first moving picture was shown in the UK in 1896 by the Lumiere brothers. But before that, in the 1860s, it's where the illusion Pepper's Ghost was first used on stage during a Charles Dickens play. Not A Christmas Carol. You would have thought it would be, but it wasn't. So John Pepper had created this illusion for the stage, and it got his name, Pepper's Ghost. But he actually always denied that it was him who invented it. He was really annoyed that it had got his name because he had seen another inventor, which he considered to be the inventor. He tried to get people to call it Dirk's Ghost because Harold Dirk Pepper considered that he had invented it, and Pepper had just adapted it for the stage. So Dirk was thinking small, Pepper thought big. And he hated that he was getting all the credit for it and somebody else wasn't. So from this day onwards, I will refer to that illusion as Dirk's Ghost. Not that I refer to it very much, but never mind. So back to Oxford Circus. So University of Westminster is just north of Oxford Circus. Just south of Oxford Circus is Great Marlborough Street, where the first discotheque was opened in 1959. It was called La Poubelle. All very French names, discotheque and La Poubelle. It's fairly well accepted that the very first discotheques, the very first clubs with DJs rather than live music, were in Paris during the Nazi occupation because there wasn't so many musicians to go around. So in 1959, La Poubelle opened on Great Marlborough Street. Dreadful place, apparently. There were no windows. It was in a basement. It was tiny. It was hot. There were no fire escapes. There was no air, because the novelty of it, no live music, it was just DJs. Not that the term DJ existed yet, was so popular that all these famous people were attending it, including Harry Belafonte. And the reason I've chosen him is because my mum used to fancy him. Soho is full of music stuff, though, so I'm handing back to Gordon for this one.
Around the corner, actually, from Great Marlborough Street is the Bag and Ales Club. In the 1960s, it was a private members club and had been one of London's first jazz clubs. It's still a private members club. In 1966, it was where the Jimi Hendrix Experience had their first gig. It's said that those who attended that very first performance of Hendrix and his band were Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Pete Townsend, Bill Wyman, Eric Clapton, Lulu, Eric Burden, Georgie Fame, Jeff Beck, Keith Richards, Jimmy Page, the list goes on. It's not a big club, so some may be sort of rumour or possibly faulty memories. There are various, what's the word? Apocryphal moments in the history of rock and roll, which are a bit like that. Anyway, they do say, if you can remember the 1960s, you weren't actually there. Guitarist Terry Reid wrote that he was there on that night and said that there were guitar players weeping. They had to mop the floor up. When Hendrix finished, it was silence. Nobody knew what to do. Everybody was completely dumbstruck, completely in shock. It was Chas Chandler who brought Hendrix over to London in the first place, and he really made a massive impact. The Bag and Ales is in the Soho area of London, which in the 60s and 70s was the epicenter of Britain's and arguably the world music industry. So we've got a lot of other music firsts around Soho, including the first Rolling Stones concert at the Marquee Club in 1962. It's said that they didn't have a name when Brian Jones booked them for the gig, so he had to think of one up on the spot, and he chose the name of a track from a Muddy Waters album, like a Rolling Stone. Ian Stewart didn't like the name, but they were stuck with it. The first performance of the Sex Pistols was at St. Martin's College on the edge of Soho, when it's rumoured they supported Bazooka Joe or something in the... Anyway, the art students loved a bit of rebellion. So there we go. The 100 Club on Oxford Street is considered by some to be the birthplace of British punk. It opened in 1942, and it was also the first London club to introduce the dance craze jitterbug, and the first to have a Northern Soul all-nighter, which became popular up and down the country. Wigan Casino all-nighters and all this stuff. Anyway, at the other end of Oxford Street was the first HMV store, which was opened by Edward Elgar in 1921. It's where Brian Epstein had the first Beatles recording transferred to disc. The engineer who worked on it was so impressed that he told a friend who told a friend, who just happened to be George Martin, who ended up becoming the Beatles' producer.
Yep. We could go on about, there's so much music history, and so it's almost worth a tour of its own, actually. The virtual tour, we'll have to come up with that. We'll veer away from rock and roll history, though, to talk about television history. So down on Frith Street there is where what is now Bar Italia, an Italian coffee bar, is where a chap called John Logie Baird had his laboratory. John Logie Baird was a Scotsman who'd come to London to seek his fortune. And in that poky little room above what is now Bar Italia is where he invented the television, something other people were working on at the time, but Logie Baird beat them all to it. In 1925, in early 1925, he put on a demonstration in Selfridges at the other end of Oxford Street of sort of television. It was more silhouette images. But then later in 1925, in his little workshop in Frith Street above Bar Italia, is where he transmitted the very first proper television image in the world, with his puppets there, one of which is called Stooky Bill. If you're ever on a quiz show and the question is, what was the first thing to appear on television? Stooky Bill. On the same day when he'd successfully done this television, he ran downstairs to the office downstairs and grabbed one of the office boys because he wanted to see what a human face looked like. So in 1925, a young lad called William Tainton became the first person to appear on television. A few years later in the same lab is where he demonstrated the first colour television. With a little girl called Noel Gordon, who was filmed changing coloured hats on the television. Noel Gordon, who went on to appear in Crossroads from the Ministry of Useless Information. Yeah. John Logie Baird, I mean, his version of the television was actually quickly overtaken by another version, but he did definitely created the first television and was so influential that the Australian Television Awards are named Logie's in his honour. And he's so far the only person on This Is Your Life, the only dead recipient of the This Is Your Life show. Just one more story in Soho, just because it's kind of funny. In Soho Square there is where this chap had a rather embarrassing day at a party. This is John Joseph Merlin, who arrived in London in the 1700s, 1760s. John Joseph Merlin was Belgian, but he was an inventor who lived in London. He tended to invent mechanical devices like mechanical clocks and mechanical orchestras and little toys and games and things. Charles Babbage actually went to a little museum that he had in Hanover Square. Perhaps that is what inspired Babbage to invent the computer. But John Joseph Merlin, so he's always inventing things, and he was invited to a party in Soho Square by Teresa Cornelis, who was a sort of socialite of the day. And John Joseph Merlin decides that he's going to premiere his latest invention, which was roller skates. So he skated into the party, playing a violin on his roller skates. He was a big hit until he realized he hadn't actually figured out a way to stop with his new invention, and he crashed into a mirror. He was hurt, not permanently. The violin and the mirror never recovered, but he wasn't hurt permanently. And that's the first recorded use of roller skates in the world, though not terribly successful. Right, so we're moving up onto Warren Street, one stop northward. We're up at Warren Street now, which is, there we go, on the map. Warren Street is, we've got lots of doctors and scientists and sort of scientific discoveries and medical advancements to talk about around here. You've got the first one, haven't you?
Starting on Gower Street with probably the most famous scientist with a connection in the area, which was Charles Darwin. When Darwin returned to London after his voyage to the Galapagos Islands on the Beagle, he moved into 110 Gower Street at the end of 1838. A few months later, he married Emma Wedgwood, granddaughter of Josiah Wedgwood, and they moved into the house on Gower Street, which they nicknamed McCall Cottage because it had very colourful decor. While he was at McCall Cottage, Darwin wrote a book about coral reefs and published his notes from the voyage on the Beagle and began work on the origin of the species. These are some of the notes that were written while he was at Gower Street. Darwin and his family moved to Down House in Kent in 1842, and his old address at Gower Street is now, rather fittingly, the Biological Sciences Building of University College, London.
There is one other blue plaque actually on Gower Street for a woman called Millicent Fawcett, who was a suffragist, who was staying with her sister, Agnes. Millicent and Agnes had another sister, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who was the first female doctor, first woman to qualify as a doctor in the UK. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson has a couple of connections with this area. She, in the 1860s, she established a hospital, the first proper hospital for women in this area. It's now remembered, it's now part of where Warren Street Underground Station is there. The hospital is University College Hospital, and the obstetrics wing, I'm not good at saying that, the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson ward is named after her, remembering the fact her women's hospital became subsumed into UCH. She also set up the first medical school for women as well near here, which became part of University College London. So she tried to help other women to realise her dream, which was to become a doctor, and she certainly did that. Sorry.
Also on the map, you can see that we've got a university and a hospital near Warren Street Underground Station. The University College London was established in 1826 as an alternative to Oxford and Cambridge, which were only open to Anglicans at the time. And the UCL was intended to be open to anyone of any religion or none, and claims to be the first university to accept any student, regardless of race, religion, or background. Although Oxford claims it's them because they admitted one student from Jamaica in 1799. So Oxford tried to steal the thunder there. One of the founders, anyway, of UCL, Jeremy Bentham, requested in his will that his body be preserved and displayed at the university, and here it is. Bentham still attends meetings and is listed in the minutes as present but not voting. UCL was the first non-USA place to join ARPANET, which was the grandfather of the internet, in 1973. This is an early map of the internet from a couple of years later. UCL is also where Queen Elizabeth II became the first monarch in the world to send an email in 1973.
Yes. So that's the University College London quad. It's a university particularly well known for its science and medicine. So we've got a few scientists and doctors and things around here who have graduated or been professors. So Francis Crick, who helped to identify the structure of DNA, was a student here. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the television, was a student at UCL. William Ramsay was a professor here when he discovered the noble gases. He was actually the first British scientist to get the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering the noble gases, helium and neon and all that lot. Joseph Lister was also a student at UCL, the chap who pioneered antiseptic surgery. And Robert Liston was a professor here. Robert Liston was, stuff your ears up if you're a bit squeamish, by the way. Robert Liston was known as the fastest knife in the West because he could amputate a limb very, very quickly. At a time, so this is pre-anesthetic days, it was really important that limbs amputations were done very quickly. It improved the chance of the patient surviving, apparently. Florence Nightingale says something similar in her notes on nursing. There was definitely close your ears if you're squeamish for this one. There was one incident where Robert Liston is said to have removed a limb in 2.5 minutes. He accidentally amputated his assistant's fingers and accidentally slashed the front of the coat of a witness. Sadly, both the patient and his assistant died of an infection, and the witness died of shock because he thought he'd just been stabbed by Liston. It's often quoted as the deadliest surgery in history. Perhaps it was that rather disastrous surgery that inspired Liston to experiment with something that was going on in America, which was anaesthetic. Liston became the first doctor in Europe to do an operation under anaesthetic. It was ether in that case, in that instance. And he said that, what was it he said? This Yankee dodge beats mesmerism hollow, because he'd been experimenting with hypnotism as a form of anaesthetic. His students at the time were Joseph Lister, who of course went on to tell people that germs were a bad thing, which is at a time when doctors wore their stains on their operating gowns with pride, which is gross. And another of his students at the time was I've forgotten his name, the chap who invented chloroform. His name's gone out of my head at the moment. So yes, good old Robert Liston. He might have had a disastrous career, but at least he embraced new ideas. One more stop up the Victoria line to Euston. Euston, which is a major railway station. So unsurprisingly, we've got railway pioneers at Euston. And is this one of yours?
During the work for the new HS2 rail, excuse me, I'm running ahead of myself. Euston Railway Station is the south terminus of the first intercity railway line in the world, the London and Birmingham Railway. Father and son George and Robert Stephenson were engineers of the line, fresh from the success of the first ever railway line in northeast England. Euston Railway Station was designed by Robert Stephenson and opened in 1837. A statue of Stephenson was erected outside the station in the 1960s. It's said that Euston Station was the real inspiration for the secret platform in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books. In the books, Harry Potter leaves for Hogwarts at King's Cross, which is very close to Euston, but many Londoners reading the books felt that the description was much closer to Euston, where the platforms are lined up and behind a wall. During work for the new HS2 railway line that will terminate at Euston, a forgotten graveyard was discovered, including the grave of Bill Richmond, a former slave who was brought to London and given his freedom. He became a boxer and is credited with being the first boxer to use the bob and weave move in the ring and not get disqualified for it.
What's bob and weave? That, presumably.
Yeah, ducking and diving.
Ducking and diving. Right, I'm going outside Euston Station for my bit. That's the outside of Euston Station. Any closer than that to the station, and it does look a bit mid-20th century. To talk about one of my favourite sort of London engineers, which is a bit weird because he didn't really succeed very well at anything. It's Richard Trevithick. There he is. He was a Cornish engineer who had been doing amazing work improving steam engines in Cornish mines, but realized the potential for steam for transportation. This is the very early part of the 1800s, late 17, early 1800s. He invented a road locomotive called the Puffing Puffing Devil, something like that. But it was a bit of a failure. It was a success. It ran brilliant, excellent, but then they all went down the pub, left it running, and it blew up. A few years later, he came to London, having rebuilt his road locomotive, and there it is, Trevithick's passenger locomotive. He decided that he'd just keep running this thing through London streets to try and attract investors, which it maybe would have, except for the fact that the technology hadn't advanced enough, so it was still much more expensive than a horse, much more uncomfortable than a horse, and Trevithick accidentally crashed into a building. So no investors for that. Not stopping him though. If you fail, try again. He came back to London in 1808 with the Steam Circus, he called it. There it is. The Steam Circus was set up right outside Euston Station, where Euston Station is now, rather. It wasn't there then. And it was a locomotive on a track, so the first tracked locomotive in London. And it just went round and round and round and round. The engine was called the Catch Me Who Can, which one of his friend's daughters came up with. And it would just go round and round and round. It cost £1 to ride around on it. Wildly popular as like a visitor attraction in London, but nobody wanted to fund him out for a railway because again, he wasn't able to make it cheaper than a horse, and it still wasn't very comfortable either. He still didn't give up. He moved his whole family up from Cornwall to London, and he invented things. He tried to invent a device that tunneled under the Thames, created a tunnel under the Thames, which wasn't successful for him, but another engineer later was able to make it successful. He tried to invent a steam tugboat, which again wasn't very good for him, but another engineer a few years later, was able to make it successful. It seems that Trevithick just was slightly ahead of his time. He just didn't have the tools he had the ideas, but he didn't have the tools to make it. He ended up going to Costa Rica and helping them with their mining industry and doing well there as well. So good old Trevithick. Try again. If you don't succeed, try again. Our last railway pioneer technically should be at the neck. We should be talking about when we get back on the tube and go to King's Cross, but we're not going to. It's Nigel Gresley. Nigel Gresley worked on the London and North East Railway in Doncaster and London, and he was the engineer for the railway line, and he invented all kinds of whatsits and doodads and thingamybops to make steam engines go faster. So it was Gresley. This is his statue on King's Cross Station. He worked, his London office was at King's Cross. So he designed the Flying Scotsman engine. There's the Flying Scotsman, which was the first steam train to hit 100 miles per hour. And he also designed the Mallard steam engine, which is still the fastest steam engine in the world. 124 miles per hour is its top speed. So good old Nigel Gresley, he did fast things. But we will go to King's Cross now, which technically we should have done. Whoops, sorry. King's Cross. And I don't really have a theme here. I just have some interesting things to talk about. Two just sort of randomly interesting things. Along the Pentonville Road, though, which is this long road leading away from King's Cross, used to be the Dunn and Hewitt factory. There's Dunn and Hewitt's advert. They made instant coffee and instant chocolate. Daniel Dunn, who was one of them, had actually invented instant cocoa in the 1820s. So he was the inventor of instant cocoa. You can see on the advert here, he also claims to have invented instant coffee. Another inventor in France claims to have invented it, another one in New Zealand, another one elsewhere in the world. So all of this working at the same time. So it seems to be maybe just coincidentally, they all invented instant coffee at the same time. So Dunn and Hewitt invented hot chocolate. They also invented something that sounds vaguely disgusting, which was the Iceland moss cocoa, which was Daniel Dunn's hot chocolate, instant hot chocolate, and Iceland moss, which is a kind of lichen. It was said to be really herbal and really like Horlicks, like medicinal and good for you. We don't drink Iceland moss cocoa anymore, but everyone drinking chocolate. Thank you, Daniel Dunn. Just down the road there is an important archaeological discovery was made. It's just off the Gray's Inn Road there is where a chap called John Conyers in the 1670s discovered that during an archaeological dig. At the time, everyone said it was a giant elephant's tooth, and they thought they were digging up the remains of an animal that had been destroyed by Noah's flood. But John Conyers was the first person to say, no, this is man-made. This was made by a human, thereby insinuating, which he meant to do, that humans were a lot older than the Bible said they were. This is at a time when scientists like Newton, serious scientists, were trying to calculate the age of humanity and the age of the earth by referring to the Bible. John Conyers was the first person to suggest that these objects were man-made and that humans were a lot older than the Bible said. He was scoffed at by scientists and the church. Turned out to be true. This hand axe, it's known as the Gray's Inn round hand axe. It's 350,000 years old. It was one of the earliest artifacts of the British Museum, and the lane where it was found is known as Hand Axe Lane. It's such an important discovery in terms of our understanding of humanity's evolution, that Hand Axe Lane is where it was found. Right, sorry, my boring time team excitement. Back to King's Cross for our last couple.
Beginning with St Pancras Old Church, which claims to be the oldest site of Christian worship in Europe. And around it, we can see its graveyard. Chevalier d'Eon is buried in St Pancras Churchyard. d'Eon was the first openly transvestite man in Britain. d'Eon was born male, but identified as female. He made her money in London in the 1780s after her French pension was stopped, and she continued to teach French and putting on fencing displays to make money. The churchyard also contains the tomb of the architect Sir John Soane, which he himself designed as a mausoleum for him and his wife. The tomb inspired Giles Gilbert Scott's design for the iconic red telephone box in the 1920s, which wasn't the first public call box, but has definitely become the most iconic. One of Gilbert Scott's phone boxes near Parliament Square is the most photographed phone box in the world. Probably because you've got Big Ben in the background as well, haven't you?
Probably,
You can take that photograph. Parliament Square is the most photographed phone booth in the world. Gilbert Scott echoed the curves of the phone box in his design for Waterloo Bridge, which Londoners and visitors have been describing as the best view in London for centuries.
There we go. And ending with a John Constable.
Thank you.
And that's it. That's all for our little tour about things that have been made in London. We could have done a lot more, so we may do an episode 2.
It said, Earth hath nothing more fair than the view from Westminster Bridge.
Wordsworth.
It was Wordsworth, yes.
Wrong bridge, but only just down the river.
Yeah, well, let's not. You can't beat a good story.
That's true. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you've had a nice time. Normally we'd give a vulgar tip speech at this point, and our virtual tip jar is just down here. That is just my name, but what's mine is his, so you know.
Yeah.
But we'd also love it if you could donate to the MS, the Multiple Sclerosis Society, a charity close to both of our hearts.
Yes.
At justgiving.com/fundraising/virtuallylondonms. Our next tour is in a couple of weeks, and it's going to be spooky stories, tales of paranormal London. Join us if you dare.